Have you ever wondered why, despite all your prayers, some problems just don't seem to disappear from your life? Why, even when seeking God with all your heart, certain difficulties cling to you like persistent shadows? What if I told you there's a spiritual explanation for this that few people know? Pope John Paul II, in his profound wisdom, revealed a secret that many religious leaders hesitate to share. There are 7 hidden sins that silently work in our lives, blocking the blessings God desires to pour out upon us. These aren't the obvious sins we all know. They're subtle spiritual traps disguised as common behaviors. What makes these sins so dangerous? They operate in the shadows of our conscience, often masked as virtues or harmless habits. And most, surprisingly, the majority of believers don't even realize they're caught in these spiritual snares. Today, I'm going to reveal what Pope John Paul II taught about these 7 spiritual blockages, knowledge that has the power to release the blessings that seem to be held back in your life. This revelation has changed the lives of thousands of people who, like you, were seeking answers to their persistent problems. Are you ready to discover what might be blocking your spiritual life? The journey we begin now may be the turning point. You've been seeking for so long. First sin, pride. The first and perhaps most dangerous of the hidden sins is pride. Why is it so destructive? Because, as Pope John Paul II often warned, this is the only sin that disguises itself as a virtue, making it practically invisible to those who carry it. Have you ever caught yourself thinking, I don't need help. I can figure this out on my own. Or perhaps, I do things better than others. These are subtle signs of pride operating in your life. Scripture is clear when it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. James 4:6 NIV. Notice the chosen words. God doesn't just ignore, he actively opposes the proud. A striking example happened in a town in Florida. Mark, a successful businessman, lived a life of apparent success, but faced constant problems in his marriage and with his children. Despite his fervent prayers, the situation only worsened. It was during a spiritual retreat that he discovered the truth. His perfectionism, which he considered a virtue, was actually pride in disguise. I constantly criticized my wife and children, Mark confessed. I thought I was just helping them improve, but I was actually feeding my own ego. This revelation was the beginning of his transformation. Pope John Paul II explained that pride acts like an invisible wall between us and God. He said, pride makes us believe that we are the center of the universe, when in reality we are just a beloved creation that depends entirely on the Creator. How can you identify this hidden sin in our life? Observe these subtle manifestations: difficulty admitting mistakes or asking for forgiveness, tendency to correct others constantly, irritation when your opinions are challenged, frequent comparison with others, seeking superiority, inability to receive. Constructive criticism. Sarah, a teacher from a town in Texas, realized that her pride was disguised as high academic standards. I isolated myself from colleagues and students, believing that no one was at my intellectual level, she shared. When I finally recognized my pride, I asked God and those I hurt for forgiveness. The blessings that were blocked began to flow again. Pope John Paul II always emphasized, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. This shift in perspective is the first step to breaking this spiritual blockage. If this teaching is touching your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who may be trapped in this cycle without realizing it. Subscribe to our channel to receive more revelations that can transform your spiritual life. Ring the bell to be alerted about our upcoming videos. This journey of discovery is just beginning. Second sin, resentment. The second hidden sin that Pope John Paul II identified as a powerful spiritual blockage is resentment. This sin is particularly treacherous because it often disguises itself as justice or the right to be hurt. But the truth is that resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. Christ was absolutely clear about this. For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. Matthew 6:14, NIV. Notice that there are no exceptions in this passage, no unless or except when. Forgiveness is a command, not a suggestion. Peter, a 62-year-old man from a town in California, carried a deep resentment against his brother because of a disputed inheritance. "For 15 years I refused to speak to my brother," he recounts. "During that time, I suffered from chronic pain, depression, and financial problems that seemed to have no solution." Pope John Paul II, who lived under Nazi occupation and then under communist oppression, deeply understood the power of resentment. He said, "Forgiveness is not an option for the Christian. It is a necessity for our own liberation. Whoever does not forgive remains a prisoner of his own hatred." This truth manifested in Peter's life when, after an inner healing session, he finally decided to forgive his brother. "It was as if a weight of tons was removed from my shoulders," he reports. "In a few weeks, my health began to improve, and financial opportunities arose out of nowhere. I realized that my resentment was blocking not only my relationship with my brother, but also with God." How do you identify if resentment is operating in your life? Observe these signs. You mentally relive past offenses frequently. You feel satisfaction imagining the other person's suffering. You have difficulty celebrating the success of the person who hurt you. You avoid certain places or events to avoid encountering certain people. You justify your bitterness as just being realistic. Pope John Paul II taught that forgiveness is above all a personal decision, a choice of the heart that goes against the natural instinct to repay evil with evil. It doesn't depend on feelings. It's an act of will that can be done even when the pain is still present. Anna Claire, a young woman from a town in Ohio, carried a deep resentment against her father who abandoned her. "Even though I was practicing my faith, I felt like my prayers hit the ceiling and came back," she recounts. "When I finally understood that my resentment was like a padlock on my heart, I decided to forgive my father, even without feeling like it. It was at that moment that I began to experience the peace I had been seeking." Resentment is a spiritual luxury that none of us can afford. As Pope John Paul II reminded us, there is no peace without justice, and no justice without forgiveness. Your spiritual blockage may be precisely here in the forgiveness you haven't yet granted. Third sin, fear. The third hidden sin that paralyzes our spiritual life is fear. Maybe you're surprised to see fear classified as a sin. After all, isn't it just a natural emotion? Pope John Paul II, known for his famous "Be not afraid," understood that fear, when we allow it to control us, becomes a form of distrust in God. "Don't be afraid, just believe." Mark 5:36, NIV, Jesus said. In this simple phrase, Christ reveals to us that faith and fear are opposites. When one increases, the other decreases. Fear is essentially a form of backward faith. It's believing more in the power of evil than in the power of God. Lucy, a nurse from a town in North Carolina, lived dominated by fear of the future. "I saved obsessively, refused travel opportunities, avoided relationships, all for fear that something would go wrong," she confesses. "I prayed daily, but remained trapped in constant anxiety." Pope John Paul II, who lived through 2 world wars and an assassination attempt against his life, taught that fear is the root of many of our wrong decisions. He explained that when fear governs our choices, we are effectively declaring that we don't trust that God is powerful enough to take care of us. The turning point for Lucy came when she heard a sermon on the parable of the talents. I realized that the servant who buried his talent did so out of fear, and that was the only one who was condemned, she says. At that moment, I understood that my fear wasn't prudence. It was a lack of faith. How do you know if fear is operating as a hidden sin in your life? Observe these signs. You often make decisions based on the worst-case scenario. You feel anxious when thinking about the future. You avoid necessary risks for your growth. You have difficulty trusting others or new situations. You pray, but continue planning. As if God won't answer, Pope John Paul II reminded us that the antidote to fear isn't courage, but faith. Courage is resisting fear, he said, but faith eliminates it completely. When we truly believe that God is with us, fear loses its power. Mark, a businessman from a town in Pennsylvania, was on the verge of bankruptcy when he discovered this truth. I couldn't sleep, worried about the debts and the future of my family, he recounts. When I finally surrendered everything to God, not just in words, but truly trusting that He would take care of us, solutions began to appear from unexpected places. Is fear blocking the blessings in your life? Pope John Paul II gives us the solution: open, or rather, throw open wide the doors to Christ. A true faith is not the absence of problems, but the certainty that we don't face those problems alone. If you're feeling that this might be your spiritual blockage, don't keep this revelation to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs this message. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to continue this journey of spiritual transformation. The truths we are revealing have the power to liberate not only you, but everyone around. Your fourth sin, spiritual indifference. The fourth hidden sin that Pope John Paul II identified as a powerful blockage to divine blessings is spiritual indifference. This is perhaps the most subtle of all, because it develops slowly, almost imperceptibly, even among seemingly devout people. The Bible clearly warns us, "So, because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth." Revelation 3:16 NIV. These harsh words reveal how God sees spiritual indifference. It's worse in His eyes than even complete coldness. Robert, a practicing Catholic from a town in Illinois, attended Mass every Sunday, prayed before meals, and even participated in a prayer group. "Externally, I did everything right," he says, "but internally there was a void. I prayed without really connecting with God. It was like reciting a script, nothing more." Pope John Paul II frequently warned about this danger. The greatest tragedy of the modern Christian is not persecution, but indifference, when faith becomes mere routine, devoid of passion and purpose. He taught that this spiritual condition, which the Church Fathers called acedia, is a disguised form of contempt for God's gifts. For Robert, the revelation came during a spiritual retreat. The preacher asked us to imagine Jesus asking, "Do you love me?" I realized I didn't know how to answer. I practiced my religion, but I didn't really love God. It was devastating. How do you identify if spiritual indifference is operating in your life? Observe these signs. Your prayers seem mechanical, without emotional involvement. You fulfill religious obligations more out of habit than out of desire. You rarely feel joy or emotion in your spiritual life. You have difficulty talking about God with genuine enthusiasm. Your faith has little influence on your daily decisions. Pope John Paul II offered a clear antidote to this evil. Be not afraid to become the saints of the new millennium. We must rediscover prayer as a personal dialogue with God, and not just as a religious duty. That's exactly what transformed Robert's life. I started talking to God as if He were really in the room with me, with honesty, vulnerability, and real emotion, he explains. In a few weeks, my faith gained a life I had never experienced before. And interestingly, problems that had been haunting me for years began to resolve themselves. Father Pio, whom Pope John Paul II deeply admired, said, "Prayer is the key that opens the heart of God. But a key used without conviction cannot turn in the lock. Spiritual indifference is like trying to open a door with a key that you don't believe will work." Mary Claire, a young teacher from a town in Virginia, lived a lukewarm faith until she encountered this teaching. "I asked God for a relationship, for financial stability, for peace of mind, but nothing happened. When I realized that my indifference was blocking these blessings, I decided to seek God with all my heart, not just with empty words. The transformation was incredible. Not only did I receive what I asked for, but I discovered that the greatest gift was the very intimacy with God." As Pope John Paul II challenged us, do not be content with mediocrity. Spiritual indifference may be your greatest blockage, and overcoming it, your greatest liberation. Fifth, sin. Envy. The fifth hidden sin that Pope John Paul II identified as a powerful blockage in our spiritual life is envy. This sin is particularly deceptive because it often disguises itself as inspiration or admiration while secretly corroding our soul. Scripture is clear about its danger. "For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every kind of evil practice." James 3:16 NIV. Notice that envy doesn't come alone. It brings with it a spiritual disorder that affects all areas of our lives. Claudia, a marketing professional from a town in Georgia, didn't understand why, despite her constant prayers, she seemed stuck in her personal and professional life. "I followed all the rituals of faith, but I felt as if there was an invisible ceiling over my head," she recounts. "No matter how hard I tried, something always pulled me down." Pope John Paul II taught that envy is sadness at the sight of another's goods. It is the direct opposite of Christian love, which rejoices at the good of others. This definition reveals why envy is so destructive. It directly contradicts the second greatest commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. For Claudia, the revelation came during a confession. "The priest asked me if I could sincerely celebrate the success of my co-workers. I was silent. I realized that although outwardly I congratulated them, inwardly I felt bitterness when they were promoted or praised. It was envy disguised as concern." For fairness, how do you identify if envy is operating secretly in your life? Observe these signs. You feel an unexplained discomfort with someone else's success. You have a habit of pointing out flaws in the achievements of others. You experience a secret satisfaction when someone successful fails. You constantly compare yourself with others. Feeling inferior or wronged, you have difficulty sincerely praising others without mentioning your own qualities. Pope John Paul II offered a clear path to overcome this sin. Gratitude is the antidote to envy. When we recognize the gifts God has given us, we stop resenting the gifts He has given to others. It was precisely this practice that transformed Claudia's life. "I started a gratitude journal, listing every day 3 specific blessings in my life. Gradually, my focus shifted from lack to abundance, and surprisingly, I began to be able to genuinely celebrate the success of others." Father Pio, whom Pope John Paul II canonized, said, "Envy is a spiritual plague that dries our soul from the inside out. It's like an invisible rust that corrodes our relationship with God and with our neighbor." Paul, a businessman from a town in Tennessee, discovered that his spiritual blockage was precisely here. "I envied my brother's financial success and at the same time felt guilty for that envy. It was a terrible cycle," he confesses. "When I finally recognized and confessed this sin, it was as if windows of heaven opened. Businesses that were stuck suddenly moved forward, and most importantly, I regained inner peace." Could envy be silently blocking the blessings in your life? As Pope John Paul II challenged us, do not look at what you lack, but at what you already possess. Spiritual abundance begins with a grateful heart. If this message has touched your heart, share it with someone who may be struggling with this same blockage without realizing it. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We still have powerful revelations to share that can completely transform your spiritual life. Sixth sin, excessive attachment to material possessions. The sixth hidden sin that Pope John Paul II identified as a powerful blockage in our spiritual life is excessive attachment to material possessions. This sin is particularly insidious in our contemporary culture, where consumerism is celebrated and even encouraged as a sign of success. Jesus was absolutely direct about this danger. You cannot serve both God and money. Matthew 6:24 NIV. Note that Christ doesn't condemn wealth itself, but service to it. When our possessions begin to possess us, we create a significant spiritual blockage. Edward, a successful businessman from a town in Michigan, didn't understand why he felt a persistent emptiness despite his material achievements. I had the house of my dreams, the cars I always wanted, international travel, and a constant feeling that something essential was missing, he recounts. My prayers seemed to hit an invisible wall. Pope John Paul II, who lived a life of remarkable simplicity, even as leader of the Catholic Church, often warned, the danger of materialism is not in having possessions, but in allowing them to have you. He taught that excessive attachment to material possessions creates a kind of modern idolatry. We give things the place that belongs only to God. For Edward, the revelation came during a mission trip. I visited an extremely poor community, but where people radiated a joy and peace that I, with all my wealth, couldn't find. It was a shock to realize that my attachment to things was pushing me away from what really mattered. How do you identify if material attachment is operating as a blockage in your life? Observe these signs. You feel significant anxiety when thinking about losing your possessions. You dedicate more time to material acquisitions than to spiritual growth. Your self-esteem is connected to what you own or how much you earn. You have difficulty being generous without calculating the impact on your finances. Your possessions take up a disproportionate space in your thoughts and worries. Pope John Paul II offered a practical advice. Practice conscious detachment. It is not necessary to abandon everything, but it is essential to keep material things in their proper place in the hierarchy of values. That's exactly what transformed Edward's life. I began to practice conscious detachment, donating items I was particularly attached to, simplifying my lifestyle, and setting clear limits for my consumption, he explains. The result was a spiritual freedom I had never experienced before, and surprisingly, new avenues of prosperity opened up, this time without the weight of attachment. Saint Teresa of Calcutta, whom Pope John Paul II deeply admired, said, "The less we possess, the more we can give. It seems impossible, but it is not. This is the logic of love." Excessive attachment does not allow us to experience the true abundance that God desires for us. Regina, an executive from a town in New Jersey, discovered this truth the hard way. "I lost practically everything in a financial crisis," she recounts. "Initially, it was devastating. But gradually I realized that this forced loss freed me from an attachment that was stifling my spirituality. When I finally released control and the need for material security, I experienced an unexplainable peace, and surprisingly, new opportunities began to arise." Could excessive attachment to material possessions be silently blocking the blessings in your life? As Pope John Paul II reminded us, man is worth more for what he is than for what he has. This shift in perspective can be the key to unlocking blessings that were held back by this hidden sin. Seventh sin, lack of love for neighbor. The seventh and last hidden sin that Pope John Paul II identified as a powerful spiritual blockage is the lack of love for neighbor. This sin is particularly dangerous because it often disguises itself as discernment, prudence, or even zeal for the truth. Jesus was absolutely clear about the centrality of this commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew 22:39, NIV. Christ places this commandment alongside the love of God, indicating that the two are inseparable. In fact, Scripture tells us, "Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen." 1 John 4:20, NIV. Renee, a dedicated Sunday school teacher from a town in Alabama, didn't understand why her prayers seemed to go unanswered. "I followed all the commandments, attended Mass daily, fasted regularly, and yet I felt a blockage in my spiritual life," she recounts. "It was as if my prayers only went up to the ceiling." Pope John Paul II, known as the Pope of Love, often taught that love is not a vague feeling, but the concrete determination to serve the other, especially the most needy. He warned that many Christians replace true love with a set of rules, or with a superficial version of charity that doesn't touch the heart. For Renee, the revelation came during a confession. The priest asked how my relationship was with my neighbors, co-workers, and family members. I realized that although I loved humanity in the abstract, I had difficulty loving specific people with their annoying imperfections. I constantly judged, criticized mentally, and maintained emotional distance. How do you identify if a lack of love for neighbor is operating as a blockage in your life? Observe these signs. You get easily irritated by the faults of others. You tend to judge before understanding. You hold grudges, even small ones, for long periods. You talk about Christian love, but have few deep relationships. You feel uncomfortable with the emotional vulnerability of others. Pope John Paul II offered a practical path. Love is a decision, not just a feeling. Decide each morning to concretely love the people God puts in your path. This intentional approach transforms love from an abstract concept into a lived reality. It was exactly this practice that transformed Renee's life. I started making a daily list of 5 concrete acts of love, small gestures of kindness, words of affirmation, quality time with difficult people, she explains. Initially, it was mechanical, almost forced, but gradually my heart began to change. And surprisingly, the blessings that seemed blocked began to flow into my life. Mother Teresa, whom Pope John Paul II deeply admired, said, "If you judge people, you have no time to love them." This insight reveals how judgment and criticism, often disguised as concern, are actually obstacles to true Christian love. Joe, a lawyer from a town in Arizona, discovered that his spiritual blockage was precisely here. "I was known for my brutal honesty and for telling the truth without mincing words," he confesses. "When I finally recognized that this was a form of hardness of heart disguised as virtue, I began to practice intentional kindness. The transformation in my relationships was immediate, and the spiritual blockage that I had felt for years finally dissolved." Could a lack of love for neighbor be silently blocking the blessings in your life? As Pope John Paul II challenged us, love is the most powerful force in the world and the simplest manifestation of God's presence among us. If this message has touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who may be facing this same spiritual blockage. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Our journey of spiritual transformation does not end here. Continue with us to discover how to apply these powerful truths in your daily life. Now that we've revealed the 7 hidden sins that, according to Pope John Paul II, may be blocking the blessings in your life, it's crucial to understand that they rarely operate in isolation. As he taught, Sins are interconnected, like links in a chain that bind the soul. Pride often fuels resentment, which in turn generates fear. Fear can lead to spiritual indifference as a defense mechanism. Indifference opens the door to envy, which stimulates material attachment as compensation, and all of these, together, make it difficult to genuinely love your neighbor. It's a vicious cycle that needs to be broken, but how do you practically apply this knowledge to transform your life? Pope John Paul II offered a clear path, which we can summarize in 5 practical steps. First, sincere self-examination. Know yourself was a motto that the Pope often quoted. Set aside daily time to examine your conscience, not only about external actions, but about internal motivations. Ask yourself, which of these hidden sins is most present in my life today? Second, regular confession. Pope John Paul II was a fervent advocate of the sacrament of reconciliation. In confession, he said, we not only receive forgiveness, but also the grace to overcome sin. Sincere confession breaks the power of hidden sins, bringing them to light where they lose their strength. Third, practice of opposite virtues. For each hidden sin, there is a corresponding virtue that acts as an antidote. Against pride, practice humility. Against resentment, forgiveness. Against fear, faith. Against spiritual indifference, fervor. Against envy, gratitude. Against material attachment, generosity. And against lack of love, concrete charity. Fourth, community support. No one saves himself alone, the Pope taught. Seek out people who share your desire for spiritual growth. Together, it's easier to identify blind spots and encourage each other in overcoming hidden sins. Fifth, patient perseverance. Spiritual transformation doesn't happen overnight. As Pope John Paul II said, the path to holiness is a marathon, not a sprint. Consistency is more important than intensity. Teresa, a teacher from a town in Iowa, applied these 5 steps after identifying that envy and pride were her main spiritual blockages. In the first months, it seemed that nothing was changing, she recounts, but I remained faithful to the process. After a year, I realized that situations that previously provoked envy now generated genuine joy. Problems that previously seemed unsolvable began to resolve themselves naturally. Cardinal Newman, whom Pope John Paul II beatified, said, "To live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often." This insight reveals that overcoming hidden sins is not a one-time event, but a continuous process of transformation. Ricardo, a doctor from a town in Wisconsin, discovered that his greatest blockage was fear disguised as prudence. When I began to apply these steps, especially cultivating faith as an antidote to fear, it was as if a weight was removed from my shoulders, he reports. Decisions that previously paralyzed me became clear, and opportunities that I would have missed out of fear began to manifest in my life. Pope John Paul II assured us, there is no human situation that cannot be transformed by the grace of God. Your spiritual blockages, no matter how old or deep, can be overcome through this path of self-knowledge, confession, virtue, community, and perseverance. As Jesus himself promised, "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." John 8:32 NIV. The truth about these hidden sins, once recognized and faced, opens the floodgates for the blessings that God has always desired to pour into your life. We have reached the end of this journey of spiritual discovery, but in reality, we are only at the beginning of a path of transformation. Pope John Paul II, with his profound wisdom, revealed these 7 hidden sins not to discourage us, but to liberate us. Think for a moment, which of these sins resonated most deeply in your heart? Was it the subtle pride that disguises itself as perfectionism? the resentment that you justify as just being realistic, the fear that paralyzes your decisions, the spiritual indifference that cooled your relationship with God, the envy that hides behind constant comparisons, the material attachment that promises security but delivers anxiety, or the lack of genuine love that masks itself as concern for the truth. The simple fact that you recognize this sin is already the first step to liberation. As Pope John Paul II said, the recognition of sin is the beginning of healing. Imagine your life free from these spiritual blockages. Visualize the peace that will come when resentment is replaced by forgiveness, the freedom you will experience when fear gives way to faith, the joy you will feel when envy is transformed into gratitude, the blessings that will flow when all these channels are unblocked. This transformation is not only possible, it's God's plan for you. As the Pope reminded us, be not afraid to be saints. Holiness is not the absence of flaws, but the persistence in getting up every time we fall. If this message has touched your heart, share it. There are many people around you who may be trapped in one of these hidden sins without even realizing it. Your testimony may be the light that illuminates their path to freedom. And don't stop here. This journey of spiritual transformation is just beginning. Subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and continue with us on this path of discovery and liberation. In upcoming videos, we will delve deeper into each of these sins and their solutions, offering practical tools for your overcoming. As Pope John Paul II proclaimed, do not be content with mediocrity. God has a plan of fullness for your life, and removing these spiritual blockages is only the beginning. Leave a comment sharing which of these hidden sins you have perceived in your life and how you intend to overcome it. Your story can inspire others who are facing similar challenges. Until the next video, remember the Pope's words: the future starts today, not tomorrow. May God abundantly bless your journey of spiritual liberation.